Hi, and welcome back to my office. You'll notice on the screen behind me now there are some PET images. People have said, gee, we got blank screens behind you, why don't you put some pictures up? So there's a PET scan image behind me. This particular video is a very critical video, and I would strongly urge you to go on the website and look at this one in detail. I'm just going to try and touch on the key points of it. But this is about the PET Steering Committee and the breast PET trial specifically. The PET Steering Committee was the group that was initially put together by the government to look at possible roles of PET scanning for patients in Ontario. And what's key to understand about that is they are supposed to be looking for what are appropriate uses, and you just see how this demonstrates what they were actually up to. And in fact, this particular PET Steering Committee trial on breast cancer patients was the very trial that galvanized the Canadian nuclear medicine community through the Canadian Association of Nuclear Medicine they finally had to act, and they passed some unprecedented motions, as you will see as I talk about as I go on in this video. But this video and this issue of what the Ontario government did with its expert advisors did to breast cancer patients in this province, above all demonstrates the lengths to which the government will go and is going and continues to go to block patients from access to care. Again, PET is just one issue, a particularly good issue, but this is about all healthcare issues. So very briefly, on the website, what you'll see there'll be three letters. It's under the Key Players section. And under the Key Players section, there will be the PET Steering Committee, and within that web page, there will be a section on specifically about the breast PET trial. There will be other issues that will deal with the breast or with the PET Steering Committee, but this one specifically is there. And on there, you'll see there are three uploadable documents, and the first is just a letter to the PET Steering Committee announcing to them why I am now launching a website, why every reasonable attempt was made to try and get answers that the various people refused to respond to about the concerns that this trial in particular raised. So that's there. Secondly, there's some housekeeping items that I've addressed and I've not been able to get answers to. In particular, the nuclear medicine physician, there were a number of nuclear medicine physicians on the PET Steering Committee, but all but one, it would appear, was actually excluded from the writing of the various trials early on. And the nuclear medicine physician that was involved in writing the breast PET trial in particular, it's not clear that they actually have what would have been considered the basic requirements to be considered an expert in PET at that time. What was clear is that you couldn't become a PET expert in Ontario. Anybody at that time to become a PET expert had to actually leave the province because we weren't simply doing enough PET. And it was agreed pretty much generally, although an absolute requirement, but it was generally agreed that you required 3 months of exposure at a PET Center of Excellence outside of Ontario. And in fact, it's been that way subsequent, pretty much. But it's not clear that that person actually had that kind of training, so I will challenge them on that and ask them to explain why, if this training didn't take place, then to defend that. And thirdly, the most important part is the actual details behind the breast PET trial, and what are they, and why did they create such controversy. There are actually two versions of the trial. The first one was written again in secret. My colleagues and I, I was the president of the Ontario Association of Nuclear Medicine at the time. I just finished my training in PET, and I was asked to review this. I had some other colleagues look at it, and we were simply dumbfounded, because it was clear that this trial that they were proposing on breast cancer patients was unethical. I mean, it was deliberately designed to fail. What they were doing specifically was they were asking a very critical question for women with breast cancer, and that is, has the breast cancer spread from the breast into what are called lymph nodes, the first set of lymph nodes typically that this would stop at, and these are the axillary lymph nodes up here in the axilla, and here is a picture, for example, of the diagrammatic picture of the lymph nodes. But it's absolutely critical to these patients' management and their prognosis and the various treatment options as to whether or not cancer has spread there. And what's important is that even microscopic spread is important. And why did we say that this was designed to fail? Well, first and foremost and simple was that the PET scanner was physically incapable of detecting disease of that size. A PET scanner has a resolution or doesn't see things well that are under about 6 millimeters in size. So that something that literally is detected under a microscope obviously cannot be detected. So we objected to this and said, well, you're deliberately designing a trial to fail. Why would you do that? And the trial without explanation was pulled. It was then rewritten over a period of about 2 years, I think, and I remember writing the chairman of the PET steering committee and being assured, oh, they were working on this very hard and diligently and so on and so forth. So again, we had to surreptitiously behind the scenes get a copy before it was released, and we did. And there was a lot of people on that telephone conference. In fact, every physician around the PET steering committee and the Ontario Association of Nuclear Medicine Executive, with the exception of the nuclear medicine physician who was actually writing the report, were actually in on a telephone conversation. I think it's fair to say that we were essentially speechless at first, because the new improved version was the identical version to the previous trial, with such a trivial change that it wasn't worth mentioning. So at that point we said, this is not only, unethical, it's unconscionable. That particular, the discussion around that then led to a meeting later in May 2005, the annual meeting of the Canadian Association of Nuclear Medicine. A lot of discussion took place about what was going on in Ontario, and they released 3 unprecedented motions, I think, in the history of medicine in Canada. And first and foremost is that they declared that the Ontario government trials run by the PET steering committee on cancer patients were unethical. When has that ever happened, if you can imagine, for a national body of experts to declare it as unethical? They demanded the trials be halted. They demanded that a body of experts with expertise in healthcare policy, ethics, and so on be brought in to see just how could this have possibly happened in Ontario. They didn't want to evaluate the science. They knew there was none. This was completely and utterly ignored, and they put out this trial. So what were the specific things that I just want to touch on? The details, again, I would strongly urge you to go and look at that letter to the PET steering committee, because it's in detail. First, what we need to consider foremost when you're looking at research on humans is informed consent, because when you're part of a human research trial, it's much more rigid about informed consent. When you're just coming in for a chest X-ray or a bone scan, you sign this paper and the technologist goes over it, and pretty basic and straightforward about the test. When you're going to be part of a human research trial, the informed consent is much, much more rigorous. You need to be informed about absolutely every aspect of what this trial involves, including the controversies surrounding any proposals. And you'll just have to decide from the information that you have that you have access to whether or not that was in fact the case, or we don't know if it was the case. We'll have to talk to the women that were part of the trial. Okay, so first and foremost, when we think about informed consent here, was the PET steering committee was supposed to be doing, looking into what were possible uses. So what I challenged the committee on is, well, if that's the case, if you were trying to design what's the most appropriate use, why did you design a trial that was absolutely designed to fail? You knew it had to fail. It was impossible for the machine to pick up the vast majority of these patients. Before the first patient was done, you knew what the results of that trial would be. And you pulled it for some reason, and I will have some general questions asking, but why did you pull the first trial, but you released the second one? It wasn't that much difference. Do you really think that, that it took care of the concerns and so on, what the second version and so on? But again, why would they design that trial? To do that. And were these patients informed, most importantly, that the machine couldn't actually detect this cancer in the vast majority of cases? And coupled directly with that, of course, is that there is a non-trivial amount of radiation exposure to these patients from the PET scan, which also has a CT scanner attached to it. I don't want to scare anybody. This is certainly very acceptable amounts of radiation if there's a proper indication for the test. The question is, there was no indication for this test because everybody knew that the test would absolutely fail. So again, were these women informed that they were going to be exposed to a non-trivial amount of radiation when it was useless? They knew that the results of the experiment and it wouldn't work, and this would not be an appropriate indication for PET. So the next thing, of course, that it begs is going back to the idea that they were supposed to be doing research to what was the most appropriate use. Well, in fact, the rest of the world at that point, beyond the borders of Health Ministry of the Ministry of Health hallways in Queen's Park and the various expert advisory committees for the government, everybody else seemed to know that people who would with breast cancer benefit potentially from a PET scan were people who had locally advanced disease. I'm talking big-time disease at diagnosis. Fortunately, we don't see a lot of these patients anymore, but this is big disease with palpable masses in the lymph nodes and so on. And in addition, when people have known breast cancer and you're following up both for treatment, monitoring, and for restaging, PET can play a role. So then I questioned the PET steering committee, well, look, if this is what you were really trying to do, what you did in fact was you designed a trial that would fail deliberately, but more importantly, then what you did was you deliberately excluded from that trial the actual women who could have potentially benefited from a PET scan. So please explain. I've asked the PET steering committee to explain in detail. If that was their role, then why do they do this? The next part is something a little more complicated. It's called equipotential, and that is when you're running a trial, I mean, you just kind of inherently know about this. If it's obvious running the trial that it isn't working, as it was obvious it couldn't work from patient 2, so on, that, or if there's unnecessary risk to the patient, the radiation risks were unnecessary to these patients, small risks but unnecessary, or that there was a better alternative that had come along or known about when you were running this trial, which there was, to determine whether or not there was cancer spread to these sentinel nodes, and it wasn't using PET. You stopped the trial. It was very obvious that this was not working. In fact, that one of the nuclear medicine physician who was part of the writing of this presented an interim update at a meeting in Toronto and said, "Well, we're seeing a lot of PET negative studies are histologically positive," as if that was a surprise. So again, I might challenge the committee. Why did you perpetuate an experiment that was designed to fail? And of course, finally, the idea is that the evidence-based medicine tool that they were using was not scientifically valid. I mean, and again, were the patients informed about this? The evidence-based medicine tool, the health technology assessment tool, there's lots of videos on that. I won't go into in detail, but it's not invalidated. So from every perspective, as you can see, there was reason why not only did the Canadian Association of Nuclear Medicine in 2005 declare these trials unethical, but eventually Dr. Eldridger, who was the most senior member of that team, in utter extreme frustration and cynicism, resigned from the PET steering committee, expressed his regret for ever having worked with this committee and the government in general, and declared what they were doing bordered on immoral. So you can decide for yourselves. The documents are there. This is a very key portion, because again, this points out just what the government and their experts are prepared to do to cancer patients. And I've challenged them to issue a statement to the women that took like part of this press trial to explain to them exactly why they took part in such a vital process of the government's use of evidence-based medicine and just the groundbreaking work that they were all part of, or not. So again, I'm not expecting the PET steering committee to respond to me. Nobody ever has. That I've presented various people questions, and experts have presented questions and challenges too. But I'm asking you to not let up on the PET steering committee, or the government, of course, Mr. McGuinty and the Minister of Health, Ms. Deb Matthews, and I'm going to be contacting Mr. George Smith because he was the bulldog behind all of this to begin with. Don't let up on them until they explain just exactly what they did, and how little they obviously care for breast cancer patients in this province and patients in general. Thanks.